Today, I'm going to tell you a story of honor, of quiet love, and of a woman who was called something else long before she ever left town. She stepped off the stagecoach with a suitcase full of letters and a heart full of hope. But when she found the man who was supposed to be waiting for her, he looked her in the eye and said, "I never wrote to you." She should have left. Any sensible person would have. But instead, she stayed. And in doing so, she turned suspicion into trust, strangers into family, and a broken man into someone willing to fight for her name. Like stories carved from dust and fire. Hit subscribe. This ain't the last one. The stagecoach wheels ground to a halt in a plume of ochre dust as the last light of the afternoon fell over Alder Creek, Colorado. It was the kind of golden light that made old buildings look softer and hearts more hopeful. Joanna Bell stepped down from the coach in silence, her gloved hand pressing a folded packet of letters against her chest, as though they were more than paper, more than ink. They were her story, her proof, her final claim to a future she could not yet see. She stood for a moment on the edge of the boardwalk, letting the stillness of the town seep into her bones. One street, 3 wagons, a single stray dog watching her with mild interest. From a distance, it might have looked like any small town stitched into the western edge of nowhere, but to her, it was the last place left to believe in. Joanna took a breath, steadying the tremor in her spine. Her boots clicked softly against the planks as she made her way past the general store and the sheriff's office. Eyes followed her covertly from behind curtains or directly from the porches where men tipped their hats without sulling. They did not know her, but they recognized something: a woman traveling alone, dressed in city blue, with dust on her hem, walking like someone with purpose. She passed the post office where the name E. Granger was painted in a faded hand on the glass. Her fingers brushed the letter bundle again. She did not pause. She could not afford to. In her mind she whispered his name like a prayer: Daniel Harper. She had spoken it aloud on the journey west late into the night, when the wheels rumbled over the plains and the other passengers slept. Daniel, she'd said to herself, imagining the man behind the letters, measured words written in a hand both neat and masculine. Letters that had spoken not only of practical arrangements, but of long, quiet evenings, the smell of pine after a rain, and the warmth of a fire shared between 2 people, learning how to belong to the land and to each other. She reached the edge of town and found the road to the Harper ranch. It was a long walk, but she took it steady, allowing her pulse to settle and the wind to thread through her dark hair, loosening tendrils from her chignon. Above, the sky was wide, and the color of faded denim stretched across the horizon like an old hymn. The ranch house came into view as the sun slipped toward the hills. A sturdy structure, nothing fancy, just strong timber, a generous porch, and the scent of horses and hay lingering like a welcome. Joanna stepped through the gate, her heart thudding against her ribs. She smoothed her skirt with one hand and straightened her spine. This was it. This was the moment her life might begin again. The front door opened before she could knock. A man stood there, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of stillness that comes from years of silence and watching the seasons pass. His shirt sleeves were rolled up to the elbows, revealing forearms tanned and muscled by work. He had a face shaped by thought and memory, the kind that didn't smile easily, but when it did, you'd believe it was for no one else. Joanna's breath caught. He looked like someone capable of keeping promises. And she was here because of the promises he'd made on paper. "Mr. Harper?" she asked softly. His brow furrowed. "Yes." She tried to find her voice and keep it from shaking. "I'm Joanna Bell. You're bright. I've come from Boston. We've been corresponding these past months." She watched his face for recognition, for warmth, for anything. But it didn't come. Instead, Daniel Harper studied her as one might study a puzzle missing too many pieces. His voice was calm when he spoke, and it struck her harder than if he'd shouted. "I didn't write to you," he said. Joanna blinked. "I've never sent for a bride," he added, voice low, almost apologetic. "There's been some mistake." The words fell like stones into a quiet river. I have your letters," she whispered, but even as her hand reached for her coat, doubt crept in. The packet she'd clung to for weeks, it was gone. Panic curled around her ribs. She opened her mouth to explain, but nothing came. Only the sudden rush of light around the edges of her vision, the faint roaring in her ears. The long journey, the heat, the humiliation, it folded over her like a heavy blanket. Joanna Bell fainted on Daniel Harper's doorstep without ever having set foot inside his home. She awoke to the creak of a rocking chair and the scent of wood smoke and biscuits. Lamplight flickered on the far wall. A soft humming drifted from the next room, a woman's voice steady and soothing. Joanna lay in a bed. She did not recognize her boots, removed, her hair undone. The door creaked. She turned her head slowly. Daniel Harper stood in the threshold, one hand resting on the frame. He looked tired now, not the shock of a stranger at his door, but the deeper fatigue of a man carrying too many memories. He looked at her with guarded caution, but not cruelty. "You gave us a scare," he said simply. Joanna tried to sit up. The room tilted. I didn't mean to." "You're in the guest room," he interrupted gently. "You'll rest here tonight." Thank you," she whispered. There was a pause long enough to stretch between them like taut wire. "I can give you 3 days," he said at last, "to make sense of whatever brought you here. After that, if it still doesn't make sense, I'll see you safely on the stage back east." Joanna nodded, though her heart ached at the formality in his tone. "I appreciate that, Mr. Harper." His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but something else, conflict perhaps. Then he turned and left, the door clicking softly behind him. Outside the window, the stars were blooming. And inside, Joanna Bell lay awake in a stranger's house. The promise of letters now ghosted her future, hinged on 3 days in a town that had already begun to whisper her name. The dawn found Joanna Bell awake on a feather-stuffed mattress that felt firm and unfamiliar beneath her. Pale sunshine filtered through lace curtains, dancing across her face. The guest room in Daniel Harper's home was quiet, save for the soft susurrus of the wakeful household, settling into a new day. Her head still hummed with the shock of yesterday's arrival, but each breath brought fresh resolve. She rose gingerly, the remnants of her faintness still gliding at the edges of her mind. The absence of sound suggested the household's rebirth with dawn. As she eased her feet into slippers, the door swung open, revealing the ranch's steady housekeeper. Her expression was gentle but firm, as she offered a basin of warm water and bread. "You've been lucky," she said quietly, her voice a soothing tremor. "Mr. Harper could have sent you away, but he didn't. Rest now." Joanna nodded, unable to speak past the knot in her throat. She cupped water to her lips, feeling every droplet steady her nerves and awaken determination. From the doorframe stepped Jedediah, Jed Cole, aged in wisdom and son, a silent sentinel who had answered the door when she collapsed. He watched her with guarded curiosity, yet for all his presence he offered no pity. Later, when Joanna was steady enough, Daniel Harper emerged, his jaw-tight posture reserved. He met her gaze, briefly measured, assessing. There was no malice, only the shadow of weariness. The air between them felt brittle, taut, as the plain's early frost. Joanna steadied herself. "Mr. Harper, she began, then paused as she realized the weight of what she had brought upon him: confusion, disbelief, and the disruption of his ordered world. He lifted a leather-bound journal from a nearby table. Inside, her writing curled across the fragile pages, its lines of longing, fear, and resolve. He read slowly. Each word was a cellar, turning a light, faltering in a long, dark tunnel. Though he said nothing, his eyes softened a brief, fleeting tremor of compassion. But the peace of that moment shattered when Joanna tried to retrieve the letters of introduction that had anchored her journey. The envelope heavy with inked promise was gone. Gone from the pocket in her coat, gone from her hand. Panic came again, fierce and raw. I brought your letters, she stammered. I had them right here. Her voice trailed to silence. Daniel's face remained still, though his brow furrowed. Jed's presence loomed like a silent fortress. The housekeeper looked away, brow knitted. Then from the doorway she heard the clacking of boot heels. Rebecca Mayfield entered, her gaze crisp, polite as ice. Dressed neatly in prim calico, she offered a perfumed smile that failed in her eyes. "Good morning," Joanna said softly, summoning grace through trembling warmth. Rebecca inclined her head. "I hear we have a guest." Her voice betrayed nothing more than casual hospitality, but Joanna felt a prick of malice. Though Rebecca offered no harsh words, silence spoke volumes. Before the tension could thicken, Pastor Gilmore stepped into the foyer. His vestments were clean and austere face, grave eyes narrowed. "I hear troubling news," he said in low tones. "A woman arriving on false premises. Perhaps caution is advisable." Joanna's heart clenched. Whispers had already begun to circulate through Alder Creek, whispers fueled by fear and the stranger's uncertainty. When Daniel returned later that morning, the hush of the ranch house followed him. He stood behind Joanna, quiet but firm in his posture as he issued terms. 3 days. 3 days to prove she belonged, or to walk away with no harm done. The words were neither cruel nor kind, but their fairness rang with gravity. "You'll have my attention," he said. Joanna inhaled sharply, resolve crystallizing. She summoned every fiber of dignity she had left. "Thank you," she breathed. Jed appeared then, his voice low and soft. "Son, don't repeat your father's mistakes. Let kindness come first, not fear." Daniel's jaw clenched, but he nodded. No further word passed among them. That afternoon, Joanna went to Mrs. Murray's diner, taking up the offer that Daniel had mentioned, a job waiting for her. The floorboards groaned beneath her as she entered through the swinging door. She wore a simple dress and the remnants of nerves in her hands, but she held her head high. The diner smelled of coffee, cookies, and warmed molasses. Mrs. Murray herself greeted Joanna with a once-over tempered by usual Midwestern practicality. "You'll do fine," she said, voice flourished with concern and steel. "Just keep steady." Joanna nodded, folding up her freshest nerves into neat squares. She began serving coffee to farmers and foremen. Hers was a presence quiet, but thoughtful. Hands initially paused in suspicion. Eyes traced her carefully. She dipped into reserve and calm. By supper time, some nods replaced the earlier skepticism, though not openly acknowledged. Behind her, the front window framed the wide Colorado dusk, open sky, open possibility. That night, Joanna lay in bed at the ranch house again, fingers tracing the edge of her journal, tucked close. 3 days. She closed her eyes. In the shadows, Daniel stared from his door, to watch or to wonder perhaps what it took for a stranger to become more than a rumor, whispered at the diner window. The second morning broke with a thick mist hanging over the foothills, as if the land itself had secrets to keep. Joanna Bell pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stepped outside the Harper ranch house, her boots sinking slightly into the dew-laden soil. She had slept little. The whispers in town, the missing letters, the uncertainty in Daniel's eyes, none of it would allow her rest. She needed answers. Her thoughts turned again and again to the postmaster, Elias Granger. The old man had looked away too quickly when she entered the general store. The day before, fumbling with a stack of envelopes he pretended to sort. His voice when he had greeted her lacked the warmth she had once imagined in the man who ferried Daniel's letters across the country. Today she would face him. Joanna found Elias behind the post office, stacking crates of stale envelopes that would never find their homes. He wore a faded vest and spectacles, perched crookedly on his nose. When he saw her, his shoulders stiffened. "Good morning, Miss Bell," he said without looking up. Joanna stepped closer. "Mr. Granger, I'm hoping you might help me find something that's gone missing." His hands slowed but didn't stop. "Is that so? I had a bundle of letters with me when I arrived. Letters written by Daniel Harper. They're gone now." Elias paused, his fingers trembling slightly, as he set a crate down too hard. "Mail's a tricky business. Things get lost all the time." Her voice was steady. "These weren't lost in the mail. I had them with me. They were taken. Or hidden." He finally met her eyes. There was fear in them, old and rooted deep. "Some things are better left be," he muttered. "Not this," Joanna said, her tone firmer than before. "Because those letters prove I'm not a liar." Elias turned away. "A woman came to me. Said it was for Daniel's own good. Said you weren't who you claimed." Joanna's breath caught. "Rebecca Mayfield?" she asked. He didn't answer, but his silence told her everything. "She paid you," Joanna whispered. Elias's face creased with shame. "She said it'd spare the boy another heartbreak. And she knew about my brother in Topeka. Knew things she shouldn't." Joanna felt the chill of betrayal settle deeper than bone. She wanted to scream, but she simply nodded. Back at the ranch, Daniel stood on the porch gazing out toward the lower pasture. His thoughts were heavy, his posture rigid. The journal lay open on the side table behind him, Joanna's journal. She had forgotten it, or perhaps left it behind in trust. Either way, his eyes had strayed across its pages last night, long after the house had gone still. He had meant only to glance. But then the words began to unfold like a confession. "I wonder if he'll believe me. I wonder if he sees how afraid I am to hope again. I came here not for a miracle. I came to earn a place to belong." The entries were scattered, some dated during her journey, others from before. They spoke of loneliness, of courage forced from desperation, and a strange kind of hope stitched between sorrow and will. Daniel closed the book gently, as if not to startle it. Joanna Bell was not the woman he'd assumed. He felt the ice in his chest begin to crack, not fall away, but shift. That afternoon, the heat rose hard and dry. One of the ranch hands, a young man named Emmett, let out a yell near the shed, and by the time Daniel and Jed reached him, Joanna was already kneeling beside the boy, her skirt dragging in the dust, her hands pressing cloth to a bite wound just above the ankle. "It was a rattler," she said calmly. "I've slowed the bleeding, but we need to cut and draw before the swelling spreads." Daniel dropped beside her without hesitation. "You've done this before. I was a schoolteacher in Texas. We didn't always have doctors." Jed watched her work, his gruff hands steadying Emmett, while Joanna moved with quiet, practiced authority. Her voice was soft but firm. The fear in the boy's eyes dulled under her instruction. By the time they carried Emmett into the house, Jed gave Joanna a look he'd reserved for very few in his long life, a look of earned trust. "You're no stranger to this land, Miss Bell," he said simply. That night, Joanna sat alone on the back porch, her eyes tracing the stars. She had no letters, no certainty, but she had something else now, a wedge of truth and the beginning of respect. Daniel stepped outside and sat beside her in the dark, his voice low. "I read your journal." She turned slowly, unsure whether to feel violated or relieved. He continued, "I shouldn't have, but I'm glad I did." She waited. "I don't know how you ended up on my porch, but I believe you didn't come to deceive anyone." Joanna let out a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her eyes, searching the side of her face. "I'm not saying I understand everything yet," he added. But I can't pretend you haven't already done more good here than harm." The stars above blinked on, quiet and eternal. "Do you think people can start over?" she asked. Daniel didn't answer right away. "Maybe not all at once," he said. "But I think we can walk toward it piece by piece." They sat without speaking for a while, two souls sharing the silence. And though nothing had been promised, something had shifted in the space between them, like the first warm breeze after a long winter, unnoticed by most but unmistakable to those waiting for it. The wind that day came in from the east cooler than usual, laced with the scent of early autumn. Alder Creek had started its slow turn toward harvest, and the trees on the edge of town whispered in brittle voices. Joanna Bell didn't mind the cold. Her sleeves were rolled up, as she dusted the wooden shelves in Elias Granger's cramped back room sleeves, stained with old ink and postmarks. The postmaster had reluctantly accepted her help, after days of avoidance, and only after she'd shown up with a fresh pie and a look in her eyes that dared him to deny her. "Can't see much with all these stacks," she remarked, brushing cobwebs from a corner crate. "You ever throw anything away, Mr. Granger?" Alias chuckled half-heartedly. "Old habits and older sins." Joanna turned, eyebrows raised, but said nothing. She reached toward a high shelf where a stack of leather-bound ledgers tilted dangerously. As she steadied the pile, a slim wax-sealed bundle dropped behind the shelf with a muffled thud. She frowned, knelt, and reached behind the wooden brace and froze. In her hands were the letters. Tied with a simple twine, her name still visible on the uppermost envelope in Daniel Harper's handwriting. Her throat tightened. She rose slowly, her hands trembling. "Mr. Granger," she said, voice quiet and sharp, "I believe these belong to me." Elias looked at the bundle as though it might bite him. His lips pressed together. His hands trembled. "I never meant for you to be hurt," he said, almost pleading. Rebecca came to me. Said you were a threat. Said Daniel was vulnerable after everything with his fiancée. Said you were chasing his money." Joanna's eyes darkened. "And you believed her?" "She knew things," he said miserably. "About my brother in Kansas. About a draft mistake I made in '65. She said she'd expose it." I panicked. Joanna took a breath, grounding herself. "You let her lie to an entire town. You let her break a man you've known all your life. And you let me be humiliated." Elias's shoulders slumped. "I did. And now," she said, holding up the letters, "you'll help make it right." When Joanna returned to the Harper ranch, the afternoon light was spilling low across the fence, setting the fields aglow with amber. Daniel was in the barn brushing down one of the horse's heces. He didn't look up at first, but something in the air shifted, something in the way her boots met the earth. He turned. Joanna stepped forward, the letters held gently in her hand. "I found them," she said simply. Daniel took a step, brow furrowing. He reached out slowly, fingers brushing the paper as though it might dissolve. His gaze darkened as he read the familiar ink. "Elias," he said, voice like gravel. "He hid these." Joanna nodded. "Rebecca paid him, blackmailed him, told him I was after your land, your inheritance." A long silence followed. Daniel stared at the letters, then into the barn's shadowed beams, as though searching for the part of himself that still believed family meant safety. "I trusted her," he said finally, not looking at Joanna. "After my father died, she kept the books. She said she was protecting the estate. Said marriage wasn't necessary, just loyalty." Joanna's heart twisted. She used that trust to hurt us both. Daniel lifted his gaze. "Not anymore." The confrontation came swiftly. Rebecca stood on the porch in her Sunday dress, dusting a tin of tea leaves, when Daniel approached with thunder in his voice. Joanna stood behind him, the letters clutched like a flag in her hand. "I know what you did," Daniel said, voice quiet, but terrible. Rebecca froze. I found the letters, all of them. You paid Elias. You lied. Rebecca's chin lifted, composure hardening. I protected you, she said. You would have thrown this ranch away for a stranger. After everything your father built. You don't get to decide who I become, he said. She stepped forward, eyes pleading now. Daniel, I've been here all my life. Your father said my father's promises died with him, Daniel snapped. Rebecca's expression cracked, then years of calculation unraveling into disbelief. I want you gone, he said. Tonight. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. Finally, she turned face pale and walked inside. The door closed behind her with a quiet click. Joanna stood, frozen breath caught in her throat. Daniel turned slowly. She doesn't speak for this land, he said, and she sure as hell doesn't speak for me. 2 days later, the town of Alder Creek gathered in its square for the Sunday market and sermon. Joanna kept to the edge of the crowd, the eyes of the townsfolk still tracing her every move. Some were curious, others ashamed, a few openly suspicious. But this time she did not stand alone. Daniel Harper strode through the gathered men and women, like a man with nothing left to hide. He reached Joanna's side and turned to face the crowd. I've got something to say, he announced. Voices hushed. Pastor Gilmore frowned but said nothing. This woman came here under the weight of lies, Daniel said. Lies made by someone in my own family. And I believed them because I was afraid. Because it was easier to doubt than to hope. He paused, turning toward Joanna. But she's done more for this town in 2 weeks than most do in a lifetime. She saved a man's life. She earned my respect. And she deserves yours. There was silence. Then Jed Cole stepped forward, broad shoulders squared. She's got mine. A murmur moved through the crowd. Heads nodded. One by one the suspicion began to crack. Daniel looked back at Joanna. If I have anything to say about it, he said quietly, you'll never be called just a mail-order bride again. Joanna's eyes stung, but she did not cry. Not here. Not yet. Because for the first time since stepping off the stagecoach, she no longer felt like a stranger. And perhaps, just perhaps, she was beginning to be seen for who she truly was. The days that followed Daniel's public stand were quietes, but not still. Joanna could feel it in the way the wind moved through town. A hush that wasn't peace, but the slow coiling of rumor. Folks nodded at her now, but some nods were too slow. Some smiles were forced thin, like the first ice of winter. She knew something was coming, and she was right. Rebecca Mayfield had not left Alder Creek. Not really. She lingered at the edge of town, cloaked in silence and resentment. She moved with purpose beneath her wounded point, gathering allies like dry branches for a fire. Her first stop was Pastor Gilmore. The old man had long been wary of change, and he held the moral compass of the town with both hands even when it wavered. Rebecca played her part well. Soft tears, a tale of betrayal. Claims that Joanna had bewitched Daniel, seduced him into spurning blood for the thrill of something exotic, Eastern, and dangerous. She's no wife, Rebecca told him. She's a scandal-wearing perfume. Gilmore, brow furrowed, listened in silence. By the end, he believed her. It didn't take long. By week's end, a quiet mob began to form, respectable men and women who wore distrust like a church bonnet. They gathered behind the chapel, first whispering, then in the square. Then finally, they marched. Joanna was in the corral when she saw them, 20 or more, shoulders stiff, faces set. At the front stood Pastor Gilmore in black, and Rebecca at his side, white lace dress, pressed and gleaming in the midday sun. Joanna stepped forward, eyes clear. We'd like to speak with Mr. Harper, the pastor said. Joanna nodded. He's in the east pasture. We'll wait, Gilmore said, then turned to her. You should go. Joanna's hands tightened. On what grounds? You've brought confusion to this town, he said solemnly. Divided a family. Caused scandal. We don't know who you truly are. I've told you who I am, Joanna replied. It's not my fault some of you preferred the lie. Rebecca stepped forward, voice syruped with pity. You see, Joanna, even now you provoke. You make everything about yourself. Joanna's mouth opened, but before she could speak, a scream pierced the air. Smoke. From the south edge of the property, black smoke rose fast and violent. The stable. Joanna didn't think she ran. By the time Daniel and Jed returned, the fire had already consumed half the roof. The horses inside screamed, panicked. Flames leapt from wall to beam, licking the sky. And in the heart of the smoke was Joanna. She had thrown her shawl over her face, kicked open the side gate, and was guiding the terrified animals out one by one. Her arm was bleeding, slashed by flying timber. Her dress was scorched, clinging to sweat and soot. She wouldn't stop. Get her out of there, Daniel roared, charging toward the door, but Joanna stumbled through. First her hand clutching a foal's mane, coughing violently. Jed caught her before she collapsed. She saved them, someone whispered. The townsfolk had followed the smoke. Now they stood watching, silenced by the sight. But Rebecca wasn't done. She did it. Rebecca shouted suddenly, eyes wild. She set the fire herself to look like a hero, gasps Rose. Joanna, barely able to stand, turned to her. You lit that fire, she whispered. To drive me out. Liar, Rebecca spat. Then came another voice, low but firm. No, she's telling the truth. The crowd parted as Elias Granger stepped forward. His hat in hand, his voice hoarse. I saw Rebecca take the oil can from my store this morning. She told me not to worry. Said it was none of my business. Gasps turned to murmurs. Rebecca's eyes darted, but no one moved. She paid me to hide those letters, Elias said. Threatened my family. I let fear guide me. But I won't do it again. Rebecca's face crumbled. She turned to run to speak, but no one followed. Gilmore looked at her, then back at the crowd, shame creeping into his aged eyes. And then Daniel stepped forward, voice calm, clear and loud. I've stood by and watched this town judge a woman you never bothered to know. She came here with nothing but hope, and you tried to burn her out. He turned toward Joanna. If she has to leave, then so do I. A hush fell like snow. Jed stepped beside him. You'll lose more than a man if that's your choice, the old rancher said, eyes on the crowd. You'll lose yourselves. No one spoke. Finally, a young ranch hand stepped forward. She saved my brother, he said. The snake bite. Then another. She fed my kids at the diner when I had no coin. The silence broke. Eyes turned. Shoulders softened. And in the middle of them, Joanna stood, clothes torn, arm bleeding, but her spine unbroken. That night, Alder Creek was quiet again, but not in the way of before. A new stillness lingered, one built not on fear, but something beginning to resemble respect. Daniel sat on the porch with Joanna beside him, her arm bandaged, her breath calm. I should have known sooner, he said quietly. No, she replied. You knew when it mattered. He looked at her then, not as a stranger, not even as someone to be forgiven, but as someone he wanted to build something with. Someone who, against all odds, had stayed. Autumn settled gently over Alder Creek, like a quilt stitched from fading gold, and the scent of burning leaves. The air carried a softness, now less suspicion, more welcome. Folks who once turned their backs toward Joanna Bell now nodded with small, respectful smiles. A few even stopped to talk, offering children's drawings, or warm bread, or shy invitations to supper. Healing like trust didn't happen all at once, but it came slow and sure as the turning of the seasons. Joanna was still regaining her strength after the fire. Her arm bore a scar, now long, thin, and silver against the skin, But it didn't trouble her. She wore it like a ribbon earned. The townsfolk began asking her to teach their children, and so beneath the church bell, and between the columns of light pouring in through lace-curtained windows, she did. She stood at the front of the old meeting hall, with chalk in hand, a warm voice, guiding little minds through letters and stories. Children who once stared at her with now greeted her with laughter and ink-smudged papers clutched in eager hands. It was not a grand schoolhouse. The roof still leaked on rainy days, and the blackboard wobbled if leaned on too hard. But it was hers. One afternoon, after the last child had run out into the yellowing light, Joanna stayed behind to clean the slate. She hummed softly, her palm sweeping slow circles across the chalk-dusted board, when the door opened behind her. She didn't need to turn around. She knew the sound of his boots. Daniel Harper stood with a folded letter in his hand, his hat tucked beneath one arm. "You missed lunch," he said. "I was grading arithmetic." He offered a crooked smile, but his eyes gave him away. They held something deeper, something weighty. Joanna wiped her hands and looked at him. "I was writing," he said. "Took me longer than I thought." She tilted her head. "A letter." He nodded and held it out to her. The paper was thick, creased carefully. Her name was written across the front in his familiar, deliberate hand. She opened it and read, "Joanna, I never wrote those first letters. But not a day's gone by since you arrived that I haven't wished I had. If I'd known who you were, who you are, I'd have sent for you sooner. I'd have written 1,000 times over. I would have crossed the whole country just to speak your name under this scandalous. You saved more than my horses. You saved what was left of my hope. And if you'll let me, I want to build a life with you, one fence post, one morning coffee, one winter's fire at a time. Not because of obligation, but because I've come to love you. And I want to call you mine if you'll let me." Daniel stepped forward then and took her hand. His voice was steady low. "I built a bench," he said, "up on the ridge." She looked at him, lips parting in surprise. "For us." They climbed the ridge together before sundown. The sky was awash in rose and rust, and the bench, modest but sturdy, faced west toward the setting sun. Daniel guided her to sit, then knelt before her on the dried autumn grass. He didn't need grand words. He simply held her hands in his and looked into her eyes. "I want you to be my wife," he said. The wind caught her hair, tousled it gently around her cheeks. Joanna blinked slowly, her smile blooming soft and sure. "On one condition," she whispered. He raised an eyebrow. "That you keep calling me yours." Daniel smiled. "Always," and when he kissed her hand, the whole world felt quiet, like even the prairie had paused to listen. A year passed. In that time, Joanna Harper's name became as familiar in Alder Creek as the church bell or the scent of bread from Mrs. Murray's kitchen. The meeting hall was now a schoolhouse in name and spirit. A wooden sign hung proudly over the door, "Mrs. Joanna Harper, Schoolmistress." Children filed in each morning with laughter and chalk-streaked shoes. Parents waved with pride instead of caution. Joanna stood at the front of the classroom in a modest green dress, her hair pinned in soft curls, the scar on her arm, hidden by lace but never forgotten. Behind the school, a garden had begun to grow. At the ranch, Daniel stood on the front porch in the soft light of late afternoon, his hands resting on a newly hung wooden sign. The grain was smooth, the carving rough, but earnest, the Harper family est. 1881. His fingers traced the letters, and for a moment, he smiled, not just with his lips, but with his whole being. Some folks still whispered about how it all began. She was a mail-order bride, they said. But Joanna would smile when she heard it, and answer gently, if ever asked. "They called me that. Once." And sometimes when the evenings were quiet and the prairie winds hummed soft lullabies through the windows, Daniel would take her hand and say, "I called you something else, long before you ever had a chance to leave this town." And she would lean into his shoulder, eyes closing with peace. Mine. They called her a mail-order bride, but he called her something else before she ever left town. In a place where trust was scarce and rumors loud, Joanna Bell found something far greater than a name she found belonging. Not because she was chosen by letter, but because she chose to stay when she had every reason to leave. And maybe that's the real love story here. Not the grand gestures, not the fire or the vow, but the quiet decision to believe in someone day by day, even when it's hard. That's what makes a name worth carrying. That's what turns a house into a home.